Now listen, you know that feeling, right? The one where you're trying to just be present, trying to soak up a moment you absolutely earned. And suddenly you realize you don't belong, at least not according to the gatekeepers. That's exactly where this story begins, under a perfect white canopy, at the prestigious Oakhaven Academy graduation. I'm talking about Alara Vance. She wasn't wearing silk or a designer sheath. She was in her well-worn military-issue khaki jacket, the one with the faint salt stains from too many late-night garage shifts, and a pair of boots polished to a dull shine. Her uniform was her armor. She was there for her son, Orion, her 17-year-old genius, the kid who was about to give the valedictorian address. And she'd earned that seat, fourth row center, right behind the board members. A seat her son's brilliance had secured for her. But of course, that was too close for comfort for the rest of Oakhaven. That kind of real grit just didn't mix with their high thread count sensibilities. The friction started small, the kind of quiet social shunning that the truly powerful use like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Veronica Ashworth, the queen of the parent leadership board, draped in coral linen, perfectly coiffed and smelling faintly of old money and fresh entitlement, didn't just spot Alara. She registered her presence. It was like seeing a speck of motor oil dust marring the reflection on a flawless crystal table, and the offense was personal. Veronica didn't even have to look at Headmaster Thorne. She just gave a certain sharp look, a slight, almost invisible twitch of her sculpted brow, to her lieutenant, a woman named Bethany, who immediately started murmuring loudly enough for 3 rows to hear about clutter and improper dress code in the high-profile photo section. That was the signal, the official start of the purge. Before the processional even started, the first usher, a nervous young man who smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fear of losing his summer intern position, was at Alara's elbow. "Ma'am, terribly sorry, but we have a last-minute adjustment for the major donors and lifetime trustees," he stammered, his eyes practically glued to his clipboard, flickering only momentarily toward Veronica for validation. The lie was so smooth, yet so transparently cruel. "We just need you to slip back a row or two. It's a temporary, very vital reorganization. But we'll ensure you still have a great view. Absolutely." Alara didn't protest. She was raised in this town. She lived through Javier's ostracization. She knew the game. When they tell you it's about logistics or last-minute adjustments, it's always about establishing the pecking order and enforcing placement. She gathered her folded program, her only item, and moved. Not because she accepted their judgment, but because she refused to give them the spectacle of a scene. She moved, and the humiliation began its slow, inevitable march. 1 row back, isolating her from a polite wave from an acquaintance. Then 2. Then a mother with an embellished lanyard and a laminated invitation needed that space, demanding that the sunlight was unacceptable on her imported designer dress. Then another major donor needed a better sightline for her own daughter, who was graduating 3rd to last alphabetically, and whose picture simply had to be perfect. Inch by inch, polite suggestion by polite suggestion, Alara was displaced, a casualty of social warfare, pushed back until she found herself sitting utterly alone, totally forgotten, beneath a flapping, slightly peeling banner that read, "Congratulations, class of 2038's a decade early." She was in the 10th row, the periphery. It was exactly where Oakhaven wanted her, isolated, silent and visible enough to be ignored, proving that even a valedictorian's mother had a fixed place in their rigid social order. But Oakhaven didn't know Alara's story. They didn't know the steel she'd forged in the decade since her husband, Javier, was taken from her. The town had seen her collapse once. They expected her to stay down. Javier was a force of nature, loud laugh, grease under his nails, the best mechanic in 3 counties. He wasn't just a second-generation immigrant. He was a self-made man who owned his small business and refused to play their social games, refusing the handshakes and the quiet bribes to join the right country club. That audacity, that independence, was the original sin in this pristine old money town. When Alara first brought him home, her parents didn't say the ugly words no. It was far colder than that. They just let the silence at the dinner table get so thick so heavy it hung in the air like a physical weight. A judgment passed without being spoken. He's not one of us, and he never will be. They chose each other. Ilara and Javier against the town's quiet scorn, exchanging their vows at a courthouse and celebrating with barbecue. A love forged in diesel, and defiance against a town that saw their union as a downgrade for her and an overstep for him. They built a life out of extra shifts and ramen dinners in a small, mortgaged garage apartment, fighting not criminals, but credit checks and zoning board denials. And then came Orion, the most beautiful, most brilliant consequence of their love, their shared hope. Good things, however, often come with a heavy price in Oakhaven. Javier died in a horrific, preventable accident at his job. The cable snapped, a worn link ignored by management for months. The company lawyer stonewalled with practiced cruelty, drowning Ilara in paperwork she couldn't afford to fight. The town offered silence, not casseroles. They were afraid to even acknowledge the death of a working man might disrupt their comfortable bubble of tax brackets and tennis matches. The insurance vanished, the legal case evaporated into insufficient evidence, and Ilara was left holding a 5-year-old boy and a mountain of quiet rage that she swore would never turn into bitterness. Only fuel. She tried everything to break free. She tried to move to a better school district, denied. The waiting lists were strictly full. Tried to start a small, legitimate home business fixing cars, denied collateral. No credit history, sorry. When she enrolled Orion at Oakhaven Elementary, the counselors suggested he might be more comfortable in a different, less demanding class track, citing cultural differences in his learning style. They didn't call him a deviation, but the message was clear. They saw Javier in his eyes, his dark curls, his mixed-race heritage, and they didn't like what they saw challenging their all-white hierarchy of success. That was the true turning point. Ilara didn't scream. She studied HVAC certification guides and electrical schematics after Orion went to bed, mastering them not just to fix things, but to understand how systems failed. She didn't seek pity. She sought power in knowledge. She mastered transmissions, wiring, and logistics, becoming the most reliable, unreadable mechanic in the county. She became a professional in survival, always waiting, always observing the weaknesses of the enemy, the infrastructure itself. Years later, a chance encounter, a broken-down military veteran client, led her to a state-run civilian emergency readiness program, the kind meant to train folks for real disaster scenarios, blackouts, floods, civil unrest. Most recruits were ex-military or first responders, seeing her as a fish out of water. Ilara was just Ilara, but she had something none of them did: the ability to read the patterns of neglect and collapse, the human factor that broke machines and systems. She was fluent in failure. That's how she met the Sentinels, a 6-man special forces team rotating through the compound for urban recon. They ignored her at first, this quiet woman in the worn jacket, assuming her role was purely administrative. But Ilara had something none of them did: the ability to read the patterns of neglect and collapse, the human factor that broke machines and systems. She was fluent in failure. Their first test was a complicated urban infiltration simulation. Ilara rerouted 2 squads through an alley not on the official map, anticipating an ambush that hadn't even been programmed into the drone feed yet. "Old utility schematics," she explained flatly. "The county never updates them, so the infrastructure is always the weakest link. That alley is the only place with unsecured access panels. They'd have to use it." She used city decay as an intelligence source. In another drill, a simulated flood zone, she predicted the exact time a critical bridge would fail, not based on engineering reports, but by analyzing the rate of water seepage into the ancient, visible concrete supports. She saw past the immediate threat to the systemic flaw. But the real, unbreakable bond was forged during the brutal blackout drill. One of the young operators, Caden, collapsed from heat stroke behind a loading dock, hidden from the command drone and the instructors. Ilara was the only one who saw the subtle change in his gait before he went down. A tiny, almost imperceptible drag of the left foot against the pavement. She ran back alone, pulling his dead weight across the hot asphalt, tearing off his gear and started dousing him with the last of her canteen water, all while screaming for medics. The instructors clocked her. 21 seconds faster than the closest assigned medic. She saved his life not with military training, but with pure practical observation and speed. After that, the 6 Sentinels stopped seeing a civilian mechanic. They saw a resource, a force multiplier. They called her the Nexus, because a Nexus isn't a weapon. It's the critical juncture where all threads meet, the point where disparate information, no matter how small, connected to form the complete, life-saving picture. They realized her talent wasn't fixing things. It was seeing things. The night before their deployment, they approached her silently, each man giving her a separate component of a single embroidered patch, representing their unit's respect. The Nexus. No ceremony, no fanfare, just a solemn nod, a quiet, powerful debt owed. She stitched it into the lining of her jacket, right over her heart, a secret anchor against the next storm. Now jump back to the graduation. Ilara is in the 10th row. The ceremony is a blur of polite applause, empty platitudes, and the clinking of champagne flutes from the VIP section. Veronica Ashworth is preening, settling into Ilara's old seat, occasionally glancing back with a satisfied smirk. Orion is on deck, standing tall by the podium, waiting for his moment. Ilara is still anchored to her spot, her hand resting on the fabric where the patch lies hidden. She prays he doesn't notice she's been moved, doesn't want this quiet act of cruelty to overshadow his day. She is invisible, and that is what Oakhaven wanted. Then the rhythm breaks. It wasn't a disruption, it was a cessation of the background noise. It started with a rhythmic, intentional sound. 6 pairs of polished dress shoes on the gravel path, moving at a pace that demanded attention but was too measured to be a rush. A silent military cadence that cut through the polite chatter. Everyone turned, sensing the profound shift in the air, a deep disruption to their controlled, predictable atmosphere. 6 men in identical dark suits, perfect posture, broad shoulders, moving in lockstep down the center aisle. They didn't rush. They didn't seek permission. They moved like gravity, like a force of nature that suddenly decided to impose order. The crowd parted around them like water, utterly confused by this sudden, powerful, and utterly uninvited presence. The silence they left in their wake was deafening. The 6 Sentinels walked right up to the foot of the stage and stopped, creating a perfect, disciplined barrier against the established hierarchy. They didn't acknowledge Headmaster Thorne, who was now not merely crimson, but a deep, apoplectic purple with a mixture of confusion and panic. Veronica Ashworth, sensing the control was slipping from her grasp, the social order collapsing, actually reached a hand up to adjust her collar. Her coral wrap suddenly trembling, a rare, mortal break in her steely composure. One of the Sentinels, the tallest, his jaw sharp and eyes focused, reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, dark green embroidered cloth, a patch identical to the one stitched inside Ilara's coat, but held aloft like a flag. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a military credential, silently overriding the entire civilian order of this event. He handed the patch to the nearest usher, whose hand trembled visibly as he received the weighty piece of fabric. Then he turned slowly, deliberately, to the stunned audience, letting the silence stretch until it was almost painful. The moment before the thunder, his voice perfectly modulated, carried across the field like a rifle shot without ever rising above a steady tone. We are here to honor the woman who taught us how to see the ambush hidden in plain sight, who didn't wear rank but earned command, because she understood patterns of failure better than any schematic, who saved one of us in the scorching heat of a compound, and saved all of us in the quiet by making us better observers, better operators. He paused, the collective gasp from the VIP section audible, a sound of fragile privilege shattering. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, stopped directly on Ilara in the 10th row. That woman right there. You call her the valedictorian's mother. We call her the Nexus. He let the word hang, heavy and unmoving, a new title consecrated in public. She is the foundation this town tried to ignore. Either way, no one in this place deserves a front row more than her. A deep, reverent hush fell over the entire field. Veronica Ashworth was frozen in the middle of a half-turn, her coral wrap suddenly looking like a cheap, flimsy costume under the harsh light of truth. Then Orion, my boy Orion, took 2 deliberate steps down from the podium and walked straight toward the disciplined line of sentinels. It was a silent acknowledgement, a passing of respect. They exchanged a look, a son understanding the weight of his mother's unseen battles, followed by a firm handshake. In unison, all 6 men gave the kid a crisp, unified salute. That was it. The tipping point, the match struck against the stone. The crowd didn't just clap. They erupted. People stood and cheered, not out of spectacle, but because they understood this wasn't just about a seat. This was about belated, essential justice being served to a woman they had collectively overlooked. When Headmaster Thorne, sweat visibly beading on his upper lip, managed to announce valedictorian Orion Vance, his voice cracked, forever losing its carefully cultivated authority. The crowd leaned in again, now listening with a fierce, expectant reverence they hadn't held moments before. Orion walked to the podium slowly, deliberately. He placed both hands on the wood, took a deep, steadying breath, and looked past the principal, past the board members, straight to his mother in the back row. The folded pages of his prepared speech, a document filled with careful academic charm, remained untouched at the base of the podium. "I had a speech," he began, his voice calm, clear, and steady, carrying the new weight of honesty. It was good. It had jokes, a polite anecdote about my chemistry teacher's pet iguana. But what I was going to say doesn't matter as much as what needs to be said right now. The silence now was absolute, demanding attention. He nodded toward his mother, a simple gesture that carried generations of meaning. "My mother has been marginalized, ignored, and pushed to the back of this town for as long as I've been alive. I've watched it all," he said, his voice tightening slightly with controlled emotion. "I watched her study HVAC manuals under the weak light of a single 40-watt bulb, while everyone else was asleep, just so she could fix the roof leaks that the landlord refused to touch. I watched her wipe engine oil off her hands at 5 a.m. so she could be on time for my school meeting, only to be met by a counselor who said she needed to put me on a less stressful academic track. But everything I've achieved, every late-night study session, every scholarship, every success, I did it with her hand steadying mine from behind the curtain, always the quiet, immovable force. And today, the ultimate disrespect, they didn't even allow her to keep her seat, the single seat her sacrifice earned. A few heads in the front row dropped in absolute shame. This was not rumor, this was fact from the source. He gestured to the sentinels, now standing like stone statues near the perimeter, their presence as silent, undeniable testimony to her real credentials. Those men didn't show up for politics or to cause a scene. They showed up because someone you chose to ignore saved them, equipped them, made them better. You talk about values here, respect, service, excellence, but those aren't words you hang on a banner or print in a glossy yearbook. They're things you live every single day, especially when no one is looking. He leaned into the mic, making his final statement intimate and profound, dropping the voice just enough to force the audience to strain to hear. Her name is Ilara Vance, and if Oakhaven values anything it claims, if this institution truly believes in the merits it champions, it will remember her name the same way it remembers its founding donors or its championship trophies. 'Cause people like her don't pass through. They don't seek status. They build foundations quietly and permanently. He stepped back. The microphone picked up the soft click of his diploma hitting the podium. No closing remarks. No clever wrap-up. The truth had been spoken and it needed no embellishment. A collective weight seemed to lift from Ilara. Orion then walked down from the stage, taking the longest, most meaningful walk of his young life, right past the entire row of confused graduates, past the board, past a shell-shocked Veronica, and straight to his mother. He bent low, kissed her cheek, and whispered those 3 sacred words. We made it. It wasn't just about graduation. It was about survival, vindication, and the end of a long, lonely battle. They sat together for the rest of the ceremony, a silent, unshakable mountain. The sentinels waited until the very last cap flew into the air. Then one by one they approached June. They didn't offer handshakes. They saluted. The leader, Caden's older brother, stepped forward and placed something in Ilara's palm, a brand new patch. Below the word Nexus, it was embroidered in gold thread. Honorary command. Ilara didn't need applause. She never had, but she accepted the truth finally acknowledged in the open. Headmaster Thorne, unable to recover his composure or his carefully constructed facade of impartiality, announced his early retirement by the end of the summer, citing personal goals and a desire to spend more time with his family. Veronica Ashworth's name didn't just vanish from the parent leadership board. Her entire family line was quietly, unofficially relegated from the town's inner circle. The vacuum they left behind wasn't filled with resentment, but with a cautious, necessary re-evaluation. But the real lasting victory wasn't the petty downfall of her detractors. The next year, and every ceremony after that, a single chair remained open in the front row, the fourth row, center. It was the only chair that was always padded, always perfectly clean. No plaque, no name card, no grand dedication. If a student, usually a curious freshman, asked about it, the teacher would just smile, nodding toward the simple, empty chair and say, "That, my friend, is for someone who never needed an invitation to belong." It's a reminder that true value isn't inherited or bought. It's earned, often in silence. It was Oakhaven's reluctant, yet permanent monument to the woman who exposed its soul. And that, my friends, is how a quiet debt paid in silence and saved lives brought justice to a woman who had spent a decade being pushed to the back. But here's the controversial part. The question I want to leave you with. Did Oakhaven truly change? Or did they just figure out how to manage the optics of public humiliation better? Did they stop being snobs? Or did they just learn to fear the power of a woman who has a team of sentinels silently watching from the edge of the crowd? Tell me what you think. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the difference between justice and public relations. If you love this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of quiet triumph.